There are football stories that begin with a trophy. Rodri's began with a decision. In the summer of 2026, Rodrigo Hernández stood on the biggest stage in international football as a World Cup champion. But years earlier, nobody could have known where his journey was heading. He was simply a boy from Madrid who loved football. And when he was around 11 years old, that love took him into the Atlético Madrid academy. The training ground was close enough that Rodri could travel there by bus. Sometimes, one of his coaches would see him waiting at the stop and give him a lift. Those journeys became more than rides to training. They became football lessons. Rodri later recalled that his coach Fran Alcoy would talk to him about the game along the way. Even at 12, Rodri was already trying to understand things that many young players were not yet thinking about. Where should a midfielder stand? Why did one player move when another received the ball? How did a team create space? Why did a successful attack begin several passes before the final opportunity? Rodri wasn't simply watching football. He was studying it. He later described having an early ability to read the game, to see where players might move and understand how space was being created. His coach recognized that unusual quality and helped him understand the holding midfield position. But football development does not always happen at the same speed. Rodri was a late developer physically. When he was 16 and 17, he wasn't yet the big, powerful midfielder the world would eventually see. Rodri himself later explained that he had not developed physically at the same pace as some of his teammates. Reports at the time also described his departure from Atlético as involving his physical development and a change in the academy structure. And so, at an age when young players are often desperate for certainty, Rodri's path suddenly changed. Atlético was no longer going to be his home. He had to leave. For most young footballers, that could feel like the end of the dream. For Rodri, it became something else, a detour, one that would eventually lead him back to Madrid. But before that happened, he had to leave the city where his football education had begun and travel to Villarreal. He was leaving behind family, friends, familiarity, and the academy that had shaped his earliest years. He was also carrying something much more important with him, an understanding of the game. And that was something nobody could take away. Because sometimes a career is not decided by the door that closes. Sometimes it is decided by what happens after you walk through it. Rodri was about to find out. In 2013, Rodri arrived at Villarreal's academy. He was still only a teenager. But this was no longer simply about surviving a setback. It was about building a future. Villarreal gave him an opportunity to continue developing, and Rodri embraced it. The move meant leaving Madrid and moving toward a completely different football environment. Years later, Villarreal remembered that period as the beginning of the development of one of the greatest players in the club's history. But at the time, Rodri was simply another young midfielder trying to make it. The difference was that he was willing to learn. And Villarreal became the place where the qualities that had been visible in flashes at Atlético could begin to develop into a complete footballing identity. The club's academy emphasized possession, positioning, and technical understanding. That environment suited Rodri. He was tall, but his game was not built around simply using his size. He could pass. He could read danger. He could recover the ball. And increasingly, he could control the rhythm of a match from deep midfield. In Villarreal's youth setup, he began to earn recognition. In the 2014-15 season, Rodri helped Villarreal's Juvenil A win the Copa de Campeones. He also became a European under-19 champion with Spain. The boy who had once been considered a late physical developer was beginning to move forward. But the next step was much bigger: the first team. In 2015, at 19 years old, Rodri made his senior debut for Villarreal in a Copa del Rey victory over Huesca. He would make 5 more first-team appearances that season. The door had opened. And now Rodri had to prove he belonged on the other side. He continued playing for Villarreal B, where he became an important midfielder. In December 2015, the club described the 19-year-old as a fundamental part of the reserve team's midfield. Rodri's own words from that period revealed something about his mentality. He wanted to keep improving step by step rather than become obsessed with the destination. That attitude would become one of the defining characteristics of his career. Step by step. Not overnight. Not through hype. Not by demanding that the world recognize him before he was ready. He simply kept learning. Villarreal's own later account of his career shows how quickly that development accelerated. After impressing with the reserve team, Rodri moved into the first team. There, he learned from established midfielders such as Bruno, Soriano, and Manu Trigueros. And by the 2017-18 season, something had changed. Rodri was no longer just a promising academy graduate. He had become a regular starter. He was now controlling games at senior level. Villarreal later recorded that Rodri made 84 appearances for the club's first team. And suddenly, the football world was beginning to notice the midfielder who had once been easy to overlook. The boy who had left Atlético was becoming a player clubs could no longer ignore. And one of those clubs was the club he had left behind. Atlético Madrid was watching. By now, Rodri's transformation was becoming impossible to miss. He had grown physically. But more importantly, his football had grown with him. He was becoming the kind of midfielder who could make an entire team feel more stable simply by being in the right place. He didn't need to sprint everywhere. He didn't need to make every possession spectacular. He could receive the ball under pressure and remain calm. He could move it forward. He could recover possession. He could protect the space in front of his defenders. And he could see problems developing before they became emergencies. That intelligence had been there when he was 12. Now, it was appearing on professional football pitches. Atlético had originally known him as a youth player. Villarreal was now presenting him to the wider football world as a serious first-team midfielder. And the statistics told part of the story. When Atlético announced Rodri's return in 2018, the club highlighted his positional play, ball recovery, passing, aerial ability, and transition play. Atlético also noted that he had been La Liga's leading ball recoverer during the 2017-18 season, with 320 recoveries. But numbers alone couldn't explain what was happening. Rodri was developing into a midfielder who made the game look slower than it really was. That is one of the most difficult qualities to develop. When pressure arrives, most players feel it. The great ones make decisions before the pressure arrives. Rodri's understanding of space allowed him to do exactly that. He didn't always win the ball with a dramatic tackle. In fact, he later explained that he had developed his own way of defending. Because of his size, going to ground could take him out of the next action, so he preferred to read the play and steal the ball in other ways. That detail tells us something important. Rodri wasn't trying to imitate another midfielder. He was discovering what worked for him. And the more he played, the clearer his identity became. Deep midfielder, controller, organizer, shield, passer, reader of the game. The player Atlético had once let leave was becoming one of the most complete young midfielders in Spain. Then came the moment that made the story come full circle. Atlético wanted him back. The club reached an agreement with Villarreal in 2018 to bring Rodri home. Their announcement described him as a player returning home after 5 seasons in Atlético's youth ranks. By then, he was 21 years old and already 1.90 meters tall. Think about that journey. A young player leaves because his development has not followed the expected timetable. He travels away from home. He grows. He learns. He earns his first-team debut. He becomes a starter. And then the club that once let him go comes calling again. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the first great circle closing. Rodri was going back to Atlético. But he was not going back as the same boy. He was returning as a professional midfielder. And somewhere between Madrid and Villarreal, the player had changed. The footballer who once needed time to grow had discovered something more valuable than physical strength. He had discovered how to control a football match. And the next stage of his journey would take that ability to a completely different level. Spain was beginning to notice. Europe was beginning to notice. And soon, Manchester City would be watching too. The boy Atlético once let go was coming home. But he was only getting started. In football, coming home can be complicated. Sometimes you return because you never really left. Sometimes you return because you have unfinished business. And sometimes you return as a completely different person. For Rodri, it was the third. When Atlético Madrid brought him back in 2018, the club wasn't bringing back the academy kid who had once struggled to keep pace physically with his teammates. They were bringing back a professional midfielder, a player who had spent 5 seasons away from the club's youth system, a player who had developed at Villarreal, a player who had already learned what senior football demanded. And now, suddenly, the road had brought him back to Madrid. The irony was impossible to ignore. Atlético had once allowed the young Rodri to leave. Now they wanted him back. But Rodri didn't return looking for revenge. He returned because Atlético represented another step in his development. And that distinction matters. Because his story was never really about proving one club wrong. It was about proving himself right. He had believed that he could become a professional footballer. Villarreal had given him the environment to demonstrate it. And now Atlético was giving him the chance to show it at a much higher level. The pressure was different this time. At Villarreal, Rodri had been the young midfielder trying to establish himself. At Atlético, every match carried enormous expectations. The club was competing at the highest level in Spain and Europe. The midfield was already filled with experienced players, and Rodri had to earn his place. But the qualities that had developed at Villarreal translated: his positioning, his composure, his ability to recover possession, his passing, his understanding of space. The same qualities that had once made him a promising teenager were now making him an important professional. And there was another important change. Rodri was no longer simply learning how to play the position. He was learning how to control it. The holding midfielder's job can be invisible when it is done correctly. If the defender never gets isolated, the midfielder has done his job. If the attacking player receives the ball in space, the midfielder has already solved the problem. If the team can build from the back without losing control, someone is usually making those decisions. Rodri was becoming that player. And Atletico wasn't the final destination. It was the next classroom. Because while Rodri was developing in Madrid, another manager was building one of the most influential football systems of the modern era. Pep Guardiola was watching, and Manchester City was beginning to look toward Madrid. The next chapter of Rodri's career would take him to England. But before he left Spain, there was another stage of his development waiting: the national team. Spain. For generations, Spanish football had been associated with midfield control, possession, technique, movement, patience, the ability to make the ball do the running. Rodri grew up inside that football culture, but representing Spain was different from playing club football. At club level, a midfielder has months to learn his teammates. At international level, there are only short windows. Players arrive from different clubs, different systems, different managers, and somehow, they have to become one team. Rodri's understanding of the game made him particularly suited to that challenge. He could adapt, he could simplify, he could provide structure. And slowly, he became part of Spain's midfield future. His international development had started with Spain's youth teams. He had already won the European Under-19 championship. Now the senior national team was calling. In 2018, Rodri made his senior Spain debut. He was entering an entirely new world. The players around him were no longer prospects. They were stars, champions, players he had watched growing up. And suddenly, he was sharing the pitch with them. That could have been overwhelming. Instead, Rodri approached the game the way he always had, by understanding it. He didn't need to be the loudest player. He didn't need to demand the ball every second. He needed to know what the team needed. That would become increasingly important as his international career developed. Because Spain wasn't looking simply for another midfielder who could pass. They needed someone capable of giving the team balance. Someone who could sit behind the attacking players. Someone who could help the defense. Someone who could control transitions. Someone who could receive the ball when the pressure was highest and make the next decision calmly. Rodri was becoming that player. And then came one of the biggest decisions of his career. Manchester City wanted him. The Premier League. Pep Guardiola. A team built around possession and positional football. It was almost the perfect environment for a midfielder whose greatest weapon was understanding space. But moving to England meant something else. Rodri would now have to prove that his football could survive one of the most demanding environments in the world. The Premier League doesn't wait. The matches come quickly. The physical battles are relentless. The pressure is constant. And every weakness gets tested. Rodri was ready for the challenge. In the summer of 2019, Manchester City brought him to England. The club was paying a huge transfer fee because they believed they weren't simply signing a midfielder. They were signing the player who could become the foundation of their midfield for years. But there was still a question. Could Rodri become the player Manchester City needed? The answer would take time. And the man who would help shape it was waiting on the other side of the English Channel. Pep Guardiola. Manchester City had already become one of Europe's most powerful clubs. And at the center of its football philosophy was an idea that sounded simple but was incredibly difficult to execute. Control the game. Control the ball. Control the spaces. Control what happens next. For Pep Guardiola, the defensive midfielder was not simply a player who stood in front of the defense. He was part of the team's brain. He helped determine where the team could attack. He helped protect against counterattacks. He connected defenders with midfielders. He created passing angles. And when possession was lost, he had to understand where the danger would appear next. Rodri had been learning those principles since he was a child. Now he was entering the ultimate laboratory for them, Manchester City. When Rodri arrived in 2019, he had already developed into an outstanding midfielder. But Guardiola wanted more. More speed in his decisions. More understanding of positioning. More confidence under pressure. More responsibility. The Premier League would force him to adapt quickly. There were bigger opponents, faster transitions, less time on the ball, more physical challenges, and mistakes were punished immediately. But Rodri's calmness became one of his greatest advantages. He didn't panic. He didn't rush simply because someone was running toward him. He looked, he scanned, he received, and then he passed. Sometimes the best decision was forward. Sometimes it was sideways. Sometimes it was backward. The point was not to make the spectacular decision. The point was to make the correct one. That became Rodri's footballing identity. He made difficult football look simple. And simplicity at the highest level is not easy. It is the result of thousands of decisions made correctly. But there was another part of his game that began to evolve: his physical presence. The teenager who had once developed later than some of his peers was now a towering midfielder. He could compete in the air. He could use his body. He could protect the ball. And he could win possession without constantly needing to throw himself into tackles. Guardiola's system gave Rodri the freedom to develop those qualities. But Rodri also had to develop beyond the system. He had to become more than a player who followed instructions. He had to become a player who understood the game well enough to solve problems himself. And that was exactly what began happening. Season after season, Rodri became more important, more reliable, more influential. He began scoring goals. He began taking greater responsibility. And eventually, Manchester City's midfield became difficult to imagine without him. But there was still a question hanging over his career. Could a player whose greatest qualities were subtle become a superstar? Could a defensive midfielder become the face of a championship team? Could someone who controlled the game without constantly dominating the highlight reel become one of the best players in the world? Rodri was about to provide an answer, and it would begin with the biggest club trophy in Europe, the Champions League. In 2023, Manchester City reached the final. 90 minutes stood between the club and history. And in the most important moment of his Manchester City career so far, Rodri would do something nobody expected from the quiet controller of the midfield. He would score. By 2023, Rodri was no longer simply Manchester City's defensive midfielder. He had become one of the most important players in Pep Guardiola's entire system. But there was still something missing: the biggest European trophy. Manchester City had come close before. They had reached the Champions League final in 2021. They had experienced the pain of losing it. Now, 2 years later, they were back. And this time, the final would be played in Istanbul. Across from them stood Inter Milan. One match, 90 minutes, possibly more. And for Rodri, this was another test of everything he had become. The player who had spent years learning how to control matches now had to control the biggest match of his career. But the opening was difficult. Inter defended. Manchester City struggled to create the kind of spaces they were accustomed to finding. And then came a moment that would define Rodri's career. The ball arrived to him outside the penalty area. There was space, not much, but enough. Rodri controlled it, looked up, and shot. The ball found the net. Manchester City were ahead. And the player who had spent his entire career making other players better had just become the man responsible for the biggest goal in the club's history. It was not a typical Rodri goal. There was no spectacular run, no series of dribbles, no theatrical celebration before the ball even reached the net. There was simply recognition, space, decision, execution. Exactly what Rodri had been learning since he was a boy. Manchester City held on. The final whistle came, and Rodri had won the Champions League. He was named Player of the Match. But the significance went beyond one trophy. Rodri had crossed another line. He was no longer simply the midfielder behind City's stars. He was one of the stars. The boy who had once been considered a late developer had now scored the winning goal in a Champions League final. And Manchester City had finally reached the summit of European football. But Rodri wasn't finished. Because the next challenge would not be in England. It would be with Spain. And this time, the entire continent would be watching him. There are tournaments that make a player famous. And then there are tournaments that redefine a player's reputation. Euro 2024 was the second kind for Rodri. Spain's campaign began with confidence. The team had speed, youth, technical quality, and a midfield capable of controlling possession. But tournament football is different. One mistake can end everything. One bad night can send a favorite home. Every match carries pressure. And Spain kept advancing. Rodri started 6 of Spain's 7 matches. He completed 411 of 439 attempted passes during the tournament. He scored once. And when Spain reached the final, the midfielder was at the heart of everything. UEFA ultimately named Rodri the tournament's player of the tournament. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real story was control. Rodri gave Spain a sense of security. Behind him, defenders knew they had protection. Ahead of him, attacking players could take risks. Around him, teammates could move with confidence. That is what elite defensive midfielders do. They create freedom for everyone else. Then came the final. Spain faced England. The match was tense. The score was level. And for long periods, the game was decided by small details. Then Spain found the breakthrough. And eventually, the final whistle arrived. Spain were European champions. Rodri had won another major international trophy. But this time, there was something different. The football world was beginning to recognize him not merely as a great defensive midfielder, but as one of the best players in the world. There are years when a player's reputation grows, and there are moments when the entire football world finally agrees on what it is seeing. For Rodri, 2024 was becoming that moment. He had already won the Champions League with Manchester City. He had just helped Spain win the European Championship. He had been named player of the tournament. Now came the biggest individual question. Could a midfielder really become the best player in the world? For decades, the Ballon d'Or had been dominated by attacking superstars. Players who scored incredible goals. Players who filled highlight packages. Players whose names appeared on the front pages every week. Rodri represented something different. He represented the possibility that football intelligence could be just as spectacular as individual brilliance. And when the Ballon d'Or ceremony arrived later that year, the question finally received its answer. Rodri was going to win it. The boy Atletico once let go had become the world's best player. But football has a cruel way of reminding even the greatest players that nothing is guaranteed. And Rodri's greatest challenge was about to arrive. Not an opponent, not a final, not a tactical problem. His own body. For years, football had a familiar idea of what greatness looked like. The goal scorer, the dribbler, the player who could turn a stadium upside down with one movement. The superstar whose brilliance could be reduced to a highlight reel. Rodri represented something different. His greatest qualities were often quieter. Positioning, timing, awareness, control. The ability to make the right decision before everyone else realized a decision had to be made. And in 2024, those qualities finally received the game's most famous individual recognition, the Ballon d'Or. But Rodri hadn't arrived there through one spectacular season. He had built the case over years. At Manchester City, he had become central to a team that dominated English football. He had scored the winning goal in the Champions League final. Then, he had gone to Germany with Spain. And there, he helped his country win the European Championship. UEFA named him player of the tournament. 6 starts, more than 500 minutes, more than 400 completed passes. A tournament built around control. Spain had won the European Championship. Rodri had been at the center of it. Now, on October 28th, 2024, he walked into the Théâtre du Châtelet in Paris. 30 players had been nominated. Only one would receive the men's Ballon d'Or. And when the announcement came, it was Rodri. Rodrigo Hernández, the boy who had once left Atlético Madrid, the teenager who had gone to Villarreal, the midfielder who had spent years developing away from the spotlight. Now he was standing on the biggest individual stage in football. Ballon d'Or winner. It was more than a trophy. It was recognition of a type of football that can be difficult to appreciate immediately. Rodri had shown that dominance does not always look spectacular. Sometimes it looks like a midfielder receiving the ball under pressure and calmly finding the correct pass. Sometimes it looks like being in the right place before danger develops. Sometimes it looks like making 11 other players better. And now the world had officially recognized it. The boy who had once been considered physically behind his peers had become the best player in the world. But football does not allow anyone to stay at the summit forever. Sometimes the next chapter begins with a celebration. Sometimes it begins with silence. For Rodri, it would be both. Because only weeks before winning the Ballon d'Or, his entire career had been thrown into uncertainty. September 22nd, 2024. Manchester City were playing Arsenal at the Etihad Stadium. It was a major Premier League match. The kind of game Rodri had spent years preparing for. The kind of match where every duel mattered. But during the first half, something went wrong. Rodri went down. The injury was serious. Manchester City initially confirmed that he had suffered a ligament injury to his right knee and had traveled to Spain for specialist consultation. The diagnosis that followed was devastating, an anterior cruciate ligament injury. Rodri needed surgery. And suddenly, the player who had just reached the highest point of his career was facing months away from football. This was different from losing a final. A final ends after 90 minutes. An injury has no scoreboard. There is no opponent to defeat. No tactical adjustment that can solve it. No teammate who can simply make the problem disappear. There is only rehabilitation, day after day, week after week. Rodri later described it as the first major injury of his career. And he admitted the first month was particularly difficult. He had spent his entire life controlling football matches. Now there was something he couldn't control. He couldn't play. He couldn't train normally. He couldn't simply decide to return. His body had made the decision for him. Manchester City confirmed that Rodri underwent surgery and began a long rehabilitation process. And there was another psychological challenge. Rodri had just won the Ballon d'Or. The world was celebrating him. But he couldn't celebrate on the pitch. He couldn't help his teammates in the way he was accustomed to. He became a spectator. And for someone who lived every moment of a match, watching from the outside was its own kind of punishment. Rodri admitted that he was a terrible spectator. He wanted to react. He wanted to run. He wanted to celebrate. But he couldn't. The midfielder, whose greatest strength was control now, had to learn something entirely different: patience. And that may have been the hardest lesson of his career, because recovery does not care how many trophies you have. It doesn't care that you are the Ballon d'Or winner. It doesn't care that millions of people are waiting for you. The body decides the timeline. So Rodri went to work, quietly, without the stadiums, without the Champions League music, without the cameras following every touch. The greatest midfielder in the world had become a footballer, learning how to walk toward his next match one day at a time. And somewhere in that long rehabilitation was another question. Would Rodri ever be the same player again? The first step was accepting that there would be no shortcut. Rodri had to recover properly. Not quickly. Properly. The difference matters. A player can want to return. A player can feel better. A player can be desperate to help his team. But an elite athlete cannot simply negotiate with an injured knee. So the work continued. Rehabilitation. Strength. Movement. Recovery. More rehabilitation. And patience. For months, Rodri's football life existed mostly away from the pitch. He watched. He trained differently. He stayed connected to his teammates. He followed Manchester City's matches from the outside. And he waited. Manchester City manager Pep Guardiola repeatedly urged caution. The club reported that Rodri had returned to training activities, but that his return to competitive action would depend on medical clearance and a gradual process. Guardiola described the injury as difficult and emphasized the need to avoid rushing him back. That caution was important, because the goal was not simply to see Rodri play again. The goal was to give him a chance to play again at the level that had made him the world's best player. And while Rodri recovered, something else was happening. The clock was moving toward the 2026 World Cup. That possibility was impossible to ignore. For a footballer, the World Cup is the tournament that can define a generation. For Rodri, it represented something even more personal. A chance to return to the biggest stage. A chance to play for Spain again. A chance to complete a story that had suddenly looked unfinished. But none of that was guaranteed. Recovery does not come with promises. Every training session became another test. Every movement became another measurement. Every step forward mattered. And gradually, the silence began to change. Rodri was getting closer. The player who had spent years controlling matches was learning to control something else. His comeback, his patience, his expectations, and perhaps most importantly, his mindset. Because an injury can take football away from you, but it cannot decide what you do with the time it gives you. Rodri chose to use it. The 2026 FIFA World Cup arrived across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. 48 teams, a new tournament format, a new generation of footballers, and Spain arrived among the teams expected to compete for the title. At the center of their midfield was Rodri. The player who had spent years learning how to control matches was now playing for the biggest prize in international football. And this time, every match carried a different weight. There were no ordinary moments. Every possession mattered. Every mistake could become the moment that ended a country's dream. Rodri understood that better than almost anyone. Spain moved through the tournament. 8 matches, 8 tests, and Rodri played all 8. The midfielder who had once been forced to watch football from the sidelines was now back at the center of the biggest tournament on earth. But the deeper Spain went, the more significant the story became. Because Rodri wasn't simply completing his comeback. He was completing a football education that had begun more than a decade earlier. The boy at Atlético had learned to understand space. Villarreal had taught him senior football. Atlético had given him another taste of elite competition. Manchester City had transformed him into a world-class controller. Spain had turned him into a European champion. The Ballon d'Or had recognized him as the world's best player. The injury had taken him away. And now the World Cup was asking one final question. Could he lead Spain all the way? The answer came in the final. Spain faced Argentina, the defending champions. The team led by one of the greatest footballers of the modern era. One match separated Spain from history, and the match was decided by the smallest of margins. Spain won. One goal. Argentina had no answer. Spain were world champions. And in the middle of it all was Rodri. The boy who had once left Atletico's academy had become a World Cup champion. But the story still had one more extraordinary detail. Rodri was awarded the Golden Ball as the tournament's best player. Think about what that means. The player who had once been considered a late developer. The player who had been sent away from Atletico. The player who had spent years developing at Villarreal. The midfielder who had been questioned for not being spectacular enough. The player who had suffered a devastating knee injury. Now stood at the end of the world's biggest tournament with the World Cup in his hands, and the Golden Ball beside it. There could hardly have been a more complete ending. But perhaps the most powerful part of Rodri's story isn't the trophy. It is what came before it. Because the World Cup didn't create Rodri, it revealed him. Go back. Not to 2026. Not to Manchester. Not to Istanbul. Go back to Madrid. A young boy enters Atletico's academy. He is learning, watching, listening, trying to understand the game. At that age, nobody knows exactly what he will become. Football is full of talented children. Most never reach the professional game. Some reach the professional game and disappear. Others become very good. And a tiny number become legends. Rodri's journey could easily have taken another direction. Atletico let him leave. Villarreal became his next opportunity. And that opportunity changed everything. At Villarreal, he developed. At Atletico, he returned. At Manchester City, he evolved. With Spain, he became a champion. Then came the Champions League, the European Championship, the Ballon d'Or, the injury, the rehabilitation, the comeback, and finally, the World Cup. Every chapter added something. The rejection gave him a detour. The detour gave him development. Development gave him opportunity. Opportunity gave him responsibility. Responsibility gave him greatness. And adversity tested whether that greatness could survive. That is why Rodri's story is more than a football story. It is a story about development, about patience, about the danger of judging potential too early, and about the difference between being overlooked and being finished. Those are not the same thing. Rodri was never finished. He was still becoming. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside his career. The world often wants to know what a young player will become immediately. Is he a star? Is he special? Is he the next great thing? But football doesn't always work that way. Some players arrive early, some explode overnight, and some need time. Rodri needed time. Time to grow. Time to understand his body. Time to understand his position. Time to experience failure. Time to learn from better players. Time to discover his own style. And eventually, time turned potential into mastery. The boy Atletico once let go became the midfielder Manchester City couldn't imagine playing without. He became Spain's European champion. He became a Ballon d'Or winner. He became a Ballon d'Or winner. And then, after one of the hardest injuries of his career, he returned to become a World Cup champion. That is the full circle. Not revenge, not bitterness, not proving that everyone else was stupid. Something more meaningful. Growth. The young Rodri did not need to become someone else to reach the top. He needed to become himself. The player who could see the pass before it appeared. The player who could protect a defense without needing applause. The player who could slow a match down while everyone else was rushing. The player who understood that controlling football doesn't always mean dominating the ball. Sometimes it means controlling what happens next. And that is what Rodri did. From Madrid to Villarreal, back to Madrid, to Manchester, across Europe, through injury. And finally to the World Cup. The world remembers the champion, the Golden Ball, the Ballon d'Or, the Champions League, the trophies. But before all of that, there was a boy who simply wanted to understand football. And perhaps that is where the real story begins. Because the player who eventually controlled the biggest matches in the world first learned how to control something much smaller, his own game. And once he understood that, there was almost nowhere he could not go. Rodrigo Hernández. From an Atletico Academy player nobody could predict, to the player standing at the center of a World Cup victory. world champion. Sometimes the longest road to greatness begins with someone telling you that you're not ready. The question is what you do next. Rodri kept going.